In Redwood Hills, John Marshall, a 72-year-old World War II veteran, still proudly runs his auto repair shop. One afternoon, while diagnosing a faulty engine, the bell on his shop chimes and police officer Mark Dawson enters with two other officers. With a disdainful look, Dawson leans over John's desk, demanding protection money for the shop, implying that problems will arise if he doesn't pay. John, undeterred by the threat, firmly refuses, reminding Dawson that he has fought real enemies before, not bullies in uniform. Dawson, frustrated, warns John of the consequences, leaving a cold promise before leaving, but not without a final threat: possible fires, accidents, and delays in emergency services. As John watches them leave, he knows it's not over yet. Before we dive into the story, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Trust me, this is an episode you won't want to miss. Stay tuned. A small town nestled between tall trees and rolling hills. John Marshall ran his auto repair shop, Marshall's Auto Repair, with pride. At 72 years old, John had built his business from the ground up, transforming an old abandoned building into a thriving shop. It was a labor of love, one that he'd worked on for over 4 decades. Each day, despite his aging body, he could be found under the hood of a car, working with the same passion he had when he first started. Today was no different. The sunlight streamed through the open bay doors, casting a warm golden glow over the shop as John worked on a customer's car, his hands stained with grease, but steady as ever. The bell above the door chimed, signaling the arrival of a customer, but the voice that followed wasn't one John expected. Officer Mark Dawson, a tall, imposing figure with cold blue eyes and a sneer that never seemed to leave his face, walked in with 2 other officers in tow. John knew immediately why they were here. Dawson had been circling around the town for weeks, shaking down local businesses, extorting protection money under the guise of keeping the peace. "Nice operation you've got here, Marshall," Dawson said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity as he circled John's workbench. "Must be doing pretty well to keep it running this long. 40 years, huh?" 43, John replied, his voice steady, though a knot began to form in his stomach. He knew what was coming. Times are changing, though. Costs are up, regulations are tighter. A shop like this could use some support, Dawson said, his eyes narrowing as he leaned against the hood of a car, deliberately pushing his weight down, trying to intimidate John. Protection fees are a small price to pay for a little peace of mind. $500 a month, not a lot to keep your shop safe, is it? John's gut tightened. He had heard rumors about businesses in town being shaken down, especially those owned by minorities. Dawson wasn't offering protection, he was demanding it. "I manage just fine," John replied, locking eyes with the officer, his voice calm but firm. "My insurance and inspections are all up to date." Thompson, one of the other officers, stepped forward, trying to mask his discomfort with a professional expression. "Nobody's questioning that, Mr. Marshall. We're just here to make sure local businesses have the support they need." John had to fight back the bitter laugh that threatened to escape. Support? More like extortion with a badge. He thought about his son, Captain Jason Marshall, who was halfway across the world serving in Special Operations Command, doing things John didn't even want to know about. But this wasn't Jason's fight. This was his. "I've fought real enemies before," John said quietly, his voice steady as he stared Dawson down. You're just bullies in uniforms." Dawson's expression shifted, his fake smile disappearing, replaced by a dangerous, cold stare. He straightened up, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. "Careful, old man," he warned. "Sounds like you're disrespecting an officer of the law. That could be seen as disturbing the peace." John didn't flinch. He knew his rights. "I've served this country with honor," he said, his voice unwavering. "Earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star? I know what you're really here for." Dawson's eyes burned with barely contained rage. $500 a month, Marshall. Take it or leave it, he said flatly, his voice low and threatening. John's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight with determination. I'm not interested, he said firmly. Now, unless you're here for real police business, we're done here. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes, neither backing down. Then Dawson stepped back, his smile returning, but it was colder now, like a predator circling its prey. This isn't over, old man, he said, turning to leave. Think about what could happen to a place like this. Cars are complicated machines. Fires happen, windows break. It would be a shame if something happened and emergency services were delayed. As Dawson and his officers walked out, John stood motionless for a moment, the weight of the threat hanging in the air. He knew this wasn't the last time he'd see Dawson. The fight had just begun. The quiet streets of Redwood Hills had always been a source of pride for John Marshall. As a World War II veteran, he had seen more than his fair share of chaos and conflict, but this small town, tucked away in the hills of the Pacific Northwest, had always been a sanctuary, a place to put down roots and build something that lasted. Marshall's auto repair was his pride, his life's work, a place where he had spent decades fixing cars, teaching his son Jason the values of hard work, integrity, and standing up for what was right. But in recent weeks, the peace he had fought so hard to find was starting to crack. Officer Mark Dawson, the local cop who had somehow wormed his way into every aspect of life in Redwood Hills, had been making his presence known more and more. What began with a few whispered threats about protection quickly escalated into full-on intimidation tactics. John had refused to bow to Dawson's demands for a cut of his business, and that refusal had come at a cost. His shop had been vandalized, his windows broken, and his livelihood threatened. John had been through worse. He had fought in the jungles of Germany and across the battlefields of Europe, seeing things that no man should ever have to witness. He had fought against forces much larger than himself, and yet this small-town bully in a uniform was starting to feel like the fight of his life. Still, John didn't back down. He had always stood for justice, and the principles he fought for all those years ago had never left him. But even he knew that things were about to get dangerous. Jason Marshall had been working in Special Operations Command for several years now. His training had taken him to places far beyond Redwood Hills, and he had been involved in missions that involved more than just the military. Jason had trained with the best, learned how to handle situations where lives were on the line and where failure wasn't an option. But even with all of his expertise, nothing had prepared him for the call he received that day. It had been a simple message from his father, one that told him everything he needed to know. Dawson was escalating. Jason knew immediately what that meant. It meant that someone, somewhere, had made the mistake of thinking they could push around the people he cared about. "I'll be there, Dad," Jason had said, the decision final in his voice. Jason packed his bags quickly, not bothering to say goodbye to his team. His family, his town, needed him now. He would handle the situation the only way he knew how, with precision, control, and complete resolve. Jason arrived back in Redwood Hills a few hours later, but it was clear to him that the situation had grown even worse than he had anticipated. Dawson wasn't just some bad cop taking bribes. He was part of something much larger. The corruption had spread through the local police force like a virus, and the syndicate Dawson was working with had tentacles reaching into nearly every corner of the town. Jason met his father in the garage, and the moment they saw each other, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Jason had seen his father face down Nazis in the dead of night, and he knew that John Marshall, the man who had raised him, wasn't one to back down from a fight. But this was different. The stakes were higher. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about an entire system. "Dad, we need to end this," Jason said firmly, his voice low but unwavering. "I've got my team in place. We'll take down Dawson's operation piece by piece, but we need your help. We need the town behind us." John looked his son in the eye, his weathered face hard but proud. "You think they'll follow me, Jason?" Jason nodded. "They will. You've always been the man they respect. You've built something real here. Now it's time to fight back." The plan takes shape. Jason's first move was to infiltrate Dawson's network. He wasn't just a cop, he was a part of a much larger criminal enterprise. Jason's team had the resources to dig deep into the financials, tracking where the protection money was going and who was involved in the larger operation. The more they uncovered, the more Jason realized just how entrenched Dawson was. This was no longer just about small-town extortion. This was about dismantling a criminal empire that spanned across states, fueled by money, violence, and fear. John, on the other hand, took his place in the heart of the community. It was no surprise to anyone in Redwood Hills that Marshall's Auto Repair became the rallying point for those who were tired of living in fear. As soon as the town heard Jason was back, they began to take notice. John spoke to business owners, quietly gathering support, getting people to stop paying Dawson's protection fees. It wasn't just about standing up to a corrupt officer. It was about reclaiming their town, their homes, and their businesses. But Dawson wasn't an easy man to defeat. As John and Jason's efforts gained traction, Dawson began to lash out, growing increasingly aggressive. One morning, John arrived at the shop to find his tires slashed and a threatening note taped to the door. But instead of cowering, he felt a surge of determination. This was exactly what he had fought against in the war: tyranny, intimidation, and fear. And he wasn't going to let it win now. Jason's team continued their covert work, dismantling Dawson's financial networks, uncovering hidden accounts, and tracking down the syndicate's main players. But they weren't just fighting Dawson anymore. They were fighting a larger system of corruption that stretched far beyond the local police department. Dawson, realizing he was losing his grip on the town, turned to even darker forces for help. He called in mercenaries, professional killers, who had been trained to handle situations just like this. They arrived under the cover of darkness, well-armed and ready to do whatever it took to maintain control. The final confrontation. It all came to a head one cold evening when Dawson made his move. He and his mercenaries arrived at Marshall's Auto Repair, guns drawn and faces masked. John had been expecting something like this for days, but the sheer intensity of the attack took him by surprise. For a moment he hesitated, but only for a moment. He had seen too much in his life to let fear dictate his actions. Jason and his team had prepared for this. They had set up a perimeter around the town, tracking Dawson's every move. As Dawson's men stormed into the shop, they were met with the fury of Jason's team, who had moved silently and quickly, disarming the mercenaries before they had a chance to react. Within seconds, the tables had turned. What had started as a full-force assault on Marshall's Auto Repair was now a tactical defeat for Dawson. Jason caught up with Dawson in the alley behind the shop, where the corrupt officer had attempted to flee. Dawson's face was a mask of rage as he pressed his back against the brick wall, but there was nowhere for him to go. "You thought you could take this town, Dawson?" Jason's voice was cold, filled with contempt. "You thought you could break my father and the rest of these people? This is where it ends." Dawson's eyes flicked from side to side, looking for an escape, but it was too late. Jason had him cornered, and there was no way out. The fight was over. Dawson was arrested, and with him, the heart of the corrupt system he had built began to fall apart. Aftermath. The next few weeks were filled with cleanup and recovery. Jason's team continued to dismantle the syndicate's operations, while John, with the help of the town's citizens, rebuilt what Dawson and his men had tried to destroy. Redwood Hills was healing, slowly but surely. The fear that had once gripped the town was fading, replaced by a sense of empowerment and unity. John had fought for his town, but it was his son Jason who had brought it back from the edge. Together, they had taken on an empire of corruption and emerged victorious. But Jason knew this wasn't the end. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to expose. And no matter where his missions took him next, Redwood Hills would always be home. Jason looked over at his father standing beside him in the now bustling shop, pride swelling in his chest. "We did good, Dad," John nodded, his voice steady. "We did what had to be done." Jason's gaze softened as he glanced around the shop, the heart of the town now beating strong again. "I think it's just the beginning." And for the first time in years, Redwood Hills felt like a place where justice could thrive. It had been weeks since the arrest of Officer Mark Dawson and the dismantling of the syndicate's influence over Redwood Hills. The town, once shrouded in fear, was slowly coming back to life. Local businesses, once afraid to speak out against the protection racket, were now flourishing. The streets no longer seemed to echo with the same tension they had for years. People were rebuilding what had been torn down, not just in a physical sense, but in the sense that their community was stronger, united, and no longer afraid. But even as the town began to heal, Jason Marshall knew that things were far from over. Dawson's arrest had been a victory, but the power that had controlled the town for so long didn't vanish overnight. The syndicate was still out there, watching, waiting for a chance to reclaim the town they had lost. Jason knew they wouldn't just disappear. No, they would regroup. They would come for him, for his father, and for anyone who had dared to stand against them. Jason had seen this kind of power before. Its refusal to let go, even when it was at its weakest. And he knew it was only a matter of time before the next battle began. The call to action. One evening, as Jason sat in the office of Marshall's Auto Repair, going over old paperwork and making plans for the future, his phone buzzed. It was a secure line, one that only his closest contacts used. Jason's stomach tightened as he answered. "Jason!" The voice on the other end was calm, but Jason could hear the tension in the tone. It was Captain Sarah Williams, his second-in-command from Special Operations. "We've got a situation. The syndicate is making a move." Jason's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. "What's going on?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "They're targeting key people in Redwood Hills, the ones who helped take Dawson down. We've traced some of their operatives moving into the town, armed and ready to cause chaos. We need to act fast." Jason's mind raced as he processed the information. "I'll gather the team," he said. "We won't let them take this town back." The plan to expose the syndicate. As Jason prepared to launch a counter-offensive, he knew they had to be strategic. The syndicate, though weakened, still had deep roots. They had men in power, connections with corrupt officials, and a network that stretched far beyond Redwood Hills. But Jason had learned from their last battle. It wasn't just about stopping their physical presence. It was about cutting off their financial and political influence. Jason and his team had spent the last few weeks gathering intel on the remaining syndicate members, using connections they had within various intelligence agencies to track down their operations. This time, they weren't going to wait for the syndicate to make their move. They were going to make theirs first. They began by infiltrating the syndicate's local network, identifying key players who had been untouched in the initial takedown. These were the ones who had been operating in the shadows, pulling strings and ensuring the syndicate's survival. Jason's team knew that if they could expose these figures, they could cause a chain reaction that would cripple the organization once and for all. The unexpected betrayal. But just as they were beginning to make headway, something unexpected happened. Late one night, as Jason was finalizing plans with his team, he received an anonymous tip. The syndicate had gained an insider in the local police department. Someone had been feeding them information about their plans, their movements, and their targets. Jason's blood ran cold as he realized what this meant. Someone from within the town had betrayed them. Jason's mind immediately went to Officer Ryan Parker, the young officer who had been instrumental in exposing Dawson's operation. Ryan had been working with the team to gather information and had even helped bring down several of Dawson's associates. Could it be him? Or was there another mole hidden in their midst? "I can't believe this," Jason muttered under his breath as he called Ryan. The phone rang once, twice, and then Ryan picked up. "Jason?" Ryan's voice was shaky, but Jason could tell he was trying to keep it together. "What's going on?" "I got a tip," Jason said, trying to sound calm. "The syndicate has an insider in the department. We need to figure out who it is, and fast." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "I've been hearing whispers about someone from the inside working with the syndicate. We need to be careful who we trust, Jason. The walls are closing in." Jason took a deep breath. This was the kind of danger he had feared, the kind that came from within. "We need to meet," Jason said. "Don't tell anyone where you're going. We can't risk anyone else knowing." The hidden enemy, Jason and Ryan, met in the early hours of the morning in a secluded part of Redwood Hills. The town, once a quiet and peaceful place, now felt like a ticking time bomb. As they talked in hushed voices, Jason realized just how deep the betrayal went. It wasn't just about the police force anymore. The syndicate had embedded itself in the town's politics, businesses, and even the local media. Their reach was far greater than they had anticipated, and now they had a mole on the inside. Someone who was feeding them information on every move they made. "I don't know who it is," Ryan admitted, frustration evident in his voice. "But I'll help you find them. We can't let them take us down now, Jason." Jason nodded, his mind working through the possibilities. "We'll have to play it smart. Keep everything tight. Don't trust anyone outside the circle." The final assault, armed with this new information, Jason and his team set to work, now knowing they had an insider to root out. They began making their moves under the cover of darkness, targeting the syndicate's remaining operations, using their resources to expose every illegal activity they had been running under the radar. They weren't going to wait for the enemy to strike this time. They would take the fight to them. But just as they were about to hit one of the syndicate's biggest fronts, the mole made their move. A surprise attack by syndicate mercenaries caught Jason and his team off guard. The battle was brutal, but it was clear to Jason that this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was personal. The insider had sold them out. The betrayal revealed. In the midst of the chaos, Jason spotted something that confirmed his worst fears. A familiar figure, someone he had trusted, was speaking with the mercenaries. Detective Laura Harass, the officer who had been working closely with Ryan and had helped gather evidence during the initial investigation, was now in the enemy's hands. Jason's heart sank as the truth hit him. Laura had been the one feeding the syndicate information. She had played them all for fools. The final stand. As Jason closed in on Laura, gunfire echoed through the night. The fight was intense, with mercenaries everywhere. But Jason and his team were ready. They had anticipated this. They had trained for moments like this, where everything was on the line. The battle raged on, but as the last of the mercenaries were taken down, Jason confronted Laura. "Why?" Jason's voice was low, filled with disbelief. "You were helping us. How could you betray us like this?" Laura, her face filled with regret, looked down at the ground. "I didn't have a choice, Jason," she whispered. "The syndicate, they had my family. They said they would kill them if I didn't help. I didn't think anyone would notice. I thought I could cover my tracks." Jason shook his head. "You could have come to us. We could have helped. You didn't have to do this." In the end, Laura was arrested, and the last of the syndicate's grip on Redwood Hills was broken. The town was free, but the victory came at a cost. Jason knew that this would only be the beginning of the war against corruption. But for now, Redwood Hills had won. The ghosts of the past had been exorcised, and the town was finally free to move forward. After the battle in Redwood Hills, the air seemed to settle, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the town had finally found peace. The syndicate's influence had been severely weakened, and Jason Marshall, along with his father John, had managed to expose and remove some of the most dangerous players in the town's corruption network. But despite the victories, Jason knew that this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. Laura Harris, the mole who had been feeding information to the syndicate, had been arrested and sent to prison, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was still lurking in the shadows. He'd been through enough to know that in this world of corruption and crime, things were never as simple as they seemed. As the weeks passed, Redwood Hills began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The streets were quieter, the businesses began to recover, and the people, once divided by fear, started coming together. But the scars left by the syndicate and its grip on the town were not easily erased. Jason had seen too much to believe that the worst was over, especially with what he learned about the far-reaching arms of the organization. It was clear that the syndicate had had a foothold in more than just Redwood Hills. It had connections across state lines and even internationally. A new threat emerges. One late evening, as Jason sat at Marshall's auto repair, a cold wind blew through the small town. The streets were empty, save for a few cars passing by. He sat alone in the office, reviewing surveillance footage from the previous day's operation when his phone buzzed. It was a secure text from Captain Sarah Williams, his ally in the Special Operations team. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he opened the message. "Syndicate's back in town. New leadership. They're moving fast. We need to act now." His mind raced. He had been expecting something like this, but he had hoped that the syndicate would be more severely crippled by their recent exposure. The reality hit him hard. There was no such thing as a quiet victory. The syndicate had been weakened, but not eradicated. Their roots ran too deep. Jason quickly called Sarah back. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tense. "They brought in a new leader, someone more dangerous than Dawson ever was. Word is, this person has connections in high places. They're not just targeting the town anymore. They're aiming for the entire region. We don't know what's next, but we need to move fast." Jason clenched his jaw. "I'm going to get the team together. We're not letting them take this town again." The unseen enemy. As Jason rallied his team, they began gathering intelligence on the new leader of the syndicate. Information was scarce, but one thing was clear. This new figure was highly organized and more ruthless than the previous regime. No one knew their identity yet, but the impact of their arrival was already being felt. In Redwood Hills, businesses were starting to experience disruptions again. Broken windows, threats, and intimidation. People were scared once more. The syndicate was reasserting its control in the shadows. The old guard had fallen, but now a new, even more insidious force was rising. Jason's team worked in the shadows, monitoring every movement, tracking the syndicate's operations as best as they could. They quickly discovered that the new leader was using the syndicate's vast network of criminal activity to establish a much larger operation. They had money laundering schemes, smuggling routes, and even connections with organized crime syndicates in other states. Jason knew that this fight was going to be even more dangerous than the last, but this time he had an advantage. He knew how the syndicate operated, he knew what they were capable of, and he was ready to take them on head first. A deadly game. Jason and his team planned their strike meticulously. They knew they had to act fast before the new leader could fully consolidate power. Information was their most powerful weapon, and they spent days gathering everything they could about the syndicate's new operations and contacts. But Jason's worst fear was realized when he learned something unexpected. The syndicate had found a way to infiltrate the highest levels of power, both in Redwood Hills and beyond. Their new leader had a direct line to local politicians, law enforcement officers, and even influential businessmen across the state. The syndicate was no longer just a small-time operation. It was becoming a dangerous and well-funded criminal empire. The town had been lulled into a false sense of security, but Jason knew better. This wasn't over. The battle had just entered a more dangerous phase, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The breaking point. As Jason and his team prepared to confront the new leader, they were faced with a series of unexpected setbacks. Their plans were being sabotaged from within. Jason began to realize that the syndicate's reach had extended far beyond anything he had imagined. The mole they had previously uncovered wasn't the only one. There were others working against them, feeding information to the syndicate, ensuring that their every move was tracked. The pressure was mounting. Jason could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he wasn't about to let it break him. He had promised the people of Redwood Hills that he would fight for them, and he would keep that promise no matter the cost. A final showdown. Jason knew that the time had come for the final confrontation. The syndicate's new leader had made their move, and now Jason had to act decisively. The team launched a covert operation to bring the syndicate's operations to a halt once and for all. It was dangerous work, but it had to be done. Jason couldn't let the town fall into the same hands again. With everything on the line, Jason led the final assault on the syndicate's stronghold. The night was quiet, and the town's streets were eerily empty. Jason's team moved swiftly and silently, taking down guards, disabling security systems, and infiltrating the compound where the new leader was holed up. They had come this far, and they weren't going to stop now. The leader of the syndicate was finally revealed, Victor Black, a ruthless criminal mastermind who had been operating in the shadows for years, pulling the strings of some of the most dangerous criminal enterprises across the state. But what Victor Black didn't realize was that Jason had anticipated every move. The final battle was brutal, but Jason and his team were prepared. With swift and precise actions, they cornered Victor Black, cutting off his escape routes and capturing him before he could carry out his plans to expand the syndicate's reach even further. A new beginning. With Victor Black in custody and the syndicate finally brought to its knees, Redwood Hills was free once again. The fight had been long and hard, but the town had survived. Jason, along with his father John, had not only saved their business and their home, but had also protected their community from the grip of organized crime. As the town began to rebuild, Jason realized that the battle for justice was never truly over. There would always be new threats, new battles to fight, but for now, Redwood Hills was a place where the people could breathe easy again. And as Jason stood beside his father, watching the sun set over the town they had fought so hard to protect, he knew one thing for sure. This town would never forget the price of justice and the men who had paid it. Even though Redwood Hills had seen its fair share of turmoil, the aftermath of the syndicate's collapse had left a deeper scar than anyone expected. Jason and his father, John Marshall, were finally able to breathe a little easier, but Jason knew better than to believe that the battle for justice had ended. Corruption ran deeper than they could have ever anticipated, and the syndicate, though defeated, was only one part of a much larger web of crime and deceit. As the weeks passed, life began to return to normal in Redwood Hills. Business owners who had lived in fear started to flourish once again. The streets no longer felt tense and unsafe, but there was still a sense of uncertainty. The truth was, no matter how much progress they made, there was always someone waiting to take advantage of a power vacuum. And while Victor Black had been arrested and the syndicate was dismantled, Jason was aware of the greater enemy lurking in the background, an enemy far more dangerous than the street-level criminals they had just dealt with. A new wave of corruption. Jason's phone rang late one evening. He picked up, knowing immediately that it was Captain Sarah Williams, the one person in his corner who had the resources and the intelligence to help them navigate what was happening now. "Jason," Sarah said, her voice grim, "I've got bad news. We're not done with the syndicate. There's more to this than we thought. I've been tracking down their connections, and we've hit a wall. Victor Black wasn't the mastermind. We've been chasing the wrong ghost." Jason's stomach tightened. "What are you saying? Black wasn't the head of the operation?" "No," Sarah replied. "He was a key player, but he had a boss, a bigger boss, someone who's been pulling the strings of the syndicate from behind the scenes. And now we've learned that they're pulling resources from all over. This is no longer just about criminal enterprises. It's about the power players, the ones who control the money and the laws. It's political." Jason leaned back in his chair, the weight of the realization sinking in. This was more than just criminal activity. This was a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. Jason had fought for Redwood Hills and had helped the people of the town fight back against tyranny, but now it seemed like the real battle was just beginning. They were up against a network of corrupt officials, law enforcement, and businessmen who controlled the fate of towns like Redwood Hills. And now they had to make a decision: go after the puppets or target the puppet masters. The darker side of power. As Sarah and Jason shared intelligence, they began to uncover disturbing details. Victor Black was only a middleman in a much larger game. The new leader of the syndicate was none other than Alexander White, a name that sent chills down Jason's spine. White was known in the shadows as the true power behind the criminal empire, someone who had infiltrated every level of government and law enforcement, operating like a ghost for decades. Jason and Sarah were determined to uncover the truth, but as they dug deeper, they discovered the vast scale of White's empire. He wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a manipulator of the system itself. He had alliances with corrupt judges, senators, and even some police chiefs in key areas across the state. The web of corruption reached further than Jason could have imagined, and the fight was about to get much more dangerous. "Jason, we need to hit them where it hurts," Sarah said, a new determination in her voice. "We need to take them out from the inside. We'll gather evidence, but we'll need to move fast. We can't let White slip through our fingers. He's too powerful." Jason nodded, his resolve hardening. "This ends now. I'm not letting him control this town or any other any longer." A silent war, Jason and his team began to gather intelligence on Alexander White, but they knew that time was running out. Every move they made had to be calculated, every action deliberate. White had eyes everywhere, and Jason couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They began setting up a network of undercover operatives who could infiltrate the political and business circles that White controlled. They needed to gather as much information as they could on his connections, his operations, and his plans for the future. The goal was clear: expose him for what he truly was and dismantle his empire piece by piece. But it wasn't going to be easy. White was a man who had spent years building a carefully crafted facade, one that would be difficult to tear down. Jason, Sarah, and the team knew they couldn't just rely on brute force this time. They needed to play a long game. They would have to strike where White was weakest: his ego, his need for control, and his ability to manipulate others. If they could get inside his mind, they could start turning his network against him. But as they set their plans into motion, Jason knew this was the most dangerous mission they had ever undertaken. White was no ordinary criminal. He was a ghost, a man who had mastered the art of staying out of sight, of operating in the shadows. He had no intentions of being caught, and Jason knew that they would have to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than ever before. The stakeout weeks of planning led to the first move. Jason's team had uncovered that Alexander White was going to make a rare public appearance at a fundraising gala in Seattle. It was a high-profile event, attended by political figures, wealthy businessmen, and influential law enforcement officials. This was the perfect opportunity to get close to White, to learn about his operation firsthand, and to gather enough evidence to bring him down for good. Jason, Sarah, and their team set up a covert operation. They had agents on the ground in the gala, pretending to be part of the high society that surrounded White's every move. Jason and Sarah worked together, monitoring the situation and staying in constant communication with their team, who were embedded in the crowd. It was a tense evening, one where every second counted. They had only one shot at getting close to White, and if they failed, they knew the consequences could be dire. The tension in the air was palpable as Jason Marshall stood facing Alexander White, the mastermind who had pulled the strings of a sprawling criminal empire from the shadows. The room had grown eerily silent, the crowd unaware of the battle that was about to unfold between them. White, ever the manipulator, stood tall and composed, but Jason could see the subtle shift in his eyes. He had underestimated Jason, and now it was time to pay for that mistake. As Sarah moved to block off any escape routes, Jason kept his focus on White. "You've underestimated me," Jason said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "This time, there's no escape, no more games." White smiled, his teeth sharp, and his voice dripped with sarcasm. "You really think you've won, Marshall? This isn't just about me. This is bigger than Redwood Hills, bigger than anything you've ever faced, and the system I've created. It's untouchable. You can't tear it down." Jason didn't flinch. "You're right about one thing. This is bigger than you. It's bigger than me too. But it's over, White. Your empire is crumbling, and so is your power." With a subtle signal, Jason's team moved swiftly, clearing the path for their final assault. The gala, once full of laughter and high society chatter, had become the backdrop of a war, one that Jason had sworn to win at any cost. The man behind the curtain. For a brief moment, White's confident mask slipped. Jason noticed it, a flicker of concern in the man's eyes. But it was fleeting, and before Jason could react, White's hand moved swiftly to a button on his suit jacket. "Secure the building," White ordered through his earpiece. "Don't let them get out." The sudden command sent chaos through the crowd. Security forces who had been blending in with the guests erupted from the corners of the room, aiming to subdue anyone who posed a threat. Jason's team was ready for this, though, trained to handle this kind of situation. They acted swiftly, neutralizing the guards one by one with swift precision. But as Jason moved to confront White, another voice rang through his earpiece. "Jason, we have a problem. Backup's on its way. White's men are storming the exits." White smirked, knowing that the gala's exit points had been compromised, cutting off all routes for escape. He thought he had won, thinking that his guards could handle anything Jason and his team could throw at them. The final showdown. Jason, knowing time was running out, acted fast. He moved toward White, who was now retreating to a hidden elevator behind the large curtains of the ballroom. White's eyes gleamed with panic now. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. Jason was faster. With one last burst of energy, Jason reached White as the elevator doors were closing. He grabbed White by the arm and yanked him back. The elevator doors slid shut with a loud thud, but Jason wasn't about to let the man escape. "Let go of me!" White shouted, trying to break free. But Jason's grip was ironclad. "You've run this town for too long. It's time to face the consequences." With that, the sound of the elevator's motor was drowned out by the fight that ensued. The two men grappled, struggling for control. White, despite being outmatched physically, was a fighter in his own right, using his wit and agility to strike Jason when he least expected it. But Jason had the upper hand. He had fought battles on the battlefield, seen the horrors of war, and knew that a man like White could never be allowed to escape. The downfall. As the struggle continued, Sarah and the team fought off the remaining guards, securing the rest of the gala. With one final move, Jason landed a blow that knocked White to the ground, incapacitating him for good. White groaned in pain, but there was no escape. Jason didn't say a word as he cuffed Alexander White. The man who had once been the unseen hand pulling the strings of crime and corruption was now in his custody, stripped of his power and control. As White was escorted out of the ballroom, Jason couldn't help but think back to everything that had led him to this moment. The endless days of tracking, the sacrifices made, the dangers faced. It had all come down to this. Redwood Hills was finally free, and justice had been served. A new era in Redwood Hills days passed, and as the news of White's capture spread, the town of Redwood Hills began to breathe easier. White's empire was gone, his ties to the local politicians and corrupt officials severed. The people who had once lived in fear were now starting to rebuild, both their businesses and their trust in the system. But Jason knew that the fight wasn't truly over. There were always other battles, always more corruption to uncover, and always more enemies waiting in the shadows. But for now, Jason allowed himself a moment of peace. His town was safe, his father was safe, and for the first time in a long while, Jason could look ahead with a sense of certainty. As he stood in front of Marshall's auto repair, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the street. His father, John, stood beside him, both of them watching as the town began to heal. "We did it, son," John said quietly. "We did," Jason replied. But he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The sun had finally set over Redwood Hills, and the weight of everything Jason Marshall had fought for now rested heavily in the stillness of the night. The town, once gripped by fear and corruption, was now beginning to reclaim its life. But there was still much to be done. Alexander White's arrest had been a victory, but Jason knew that even with the most powerful players down, the system was far from perfect. There was still corruption lurking in every corner, still work to be done. For the first time in a long while, Jason Marshall stood before Marshall's auto repair and felt a sense of closure. His father, John Marshall, stood beside him, watching the community they had fought for begin to rebuild. People were returning to their businesses, smiles were becoming more common in the streets, and the dark presence that once loomed over the town seemed to be fading away. But Jason's gaze remained focused on the horizon, his mind racing through all the consequences of their actions, the choices they had made. Though they had eradicated the syndicate, their work wasn't done yet. The aftermath of victory days after Alexander White's arrest, the town buzzed with the announcement that his empire had finally fallen. News crews from all over the state had flocked to Redwood Hills, eager to cover the downfall of the notorious crime lord. But behind the flashing lights and interviews, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the town was on the precipice of something even bigger. The FBI and local law enforcement had launched their investigations, but Jason wasn't naive. He knew that White's influence didn't vanish overnight. There were still operatives in place, people who had been bought by White, and worse, people who had yet to be exposed. The syndicate might have lost its head, but the body was still out there, and it would do anything to protect its existence. The cleanup crew Jason had spent years battling corruption, watching as power-hungry individuals abused their positions for personal gain. But now with White in custody, it was clear that the syndicate's corruption was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes, new power players were moving into place to fill the gaps left by White's downfall. Jason and his team immediately started working on identifying those who had been involved with the syndicate, those who were complicit but had managed to avoid the fallout. They gathered names, reviewed financial transactions, and uncovered covert communications between high-ranking officials and criminal enterprises that still operated in the shadows. It didn't take long to realize how deep the corruption ran. Politicians, law enforcement, businessmen. White had a network that stretched across the state, and Jason's team had just begun to scratch the surface. They couldn't let their guard down. It was time to clean house, and the stakes were higher than ever. The final battle. The most shocking revelation came when Jason's team uncovered a series of encrypted documents that suggested White had one final contingency plan. Despite his arrest, White had set up a network of assets across the state, ensuring that if his empire fell, another one would rise in its place. The syndicate had already started regrouping, its members shifting their loyalties to new criminal powerhouses. Jason was furious. Redwood Hills had just begun to heal, and now they were staring down the barrel of another war. But this time, he wasn't going to wait for them to strike. He was going to take the fight to them. Jason gathered his team in the safe house. Sarah Williams, his trusted second-in-command, had tracked the syndicate's key figures, and they had pinpointed their next move, a high-profile meeting between White's former associates, local politicians, and a new wave of mercenaries. It was happening in a remote location, just outside the city. If Jason was right, it was the last piece of White's puzzle. The meeting would determine the future of the syndicate and potentially the fate of Redwood Hills. The confrontation. As the team prepared for the final showdown, Jason felt the weight of everything on his shoulders. He knew this mission would be their most dangerous yet. They would be up against an army of highly trained mercenaries, and the very heart of Redwood Hills was at stake. There was no turning back. In the early hours of the morning, Jason's team infiltrated the compound where the meeting was set to take place. The wind was biting, the trees swaying, and the air thick with tension. As they approached, Jason's mind raced through every plan, every detail of the mission. They had no room for error. Inside the compound, a large conference room was set up. It was clear that the meeting was about to begin. Jason's team took their positions, preparing to storm the building at a moment's notice. The silence was broken only by the sound of Jason's earpiece crackling. "It's time," Sarah's voice whispered. "We go in now." With a single signal, Jason's team moved in. They breached the building swiftly, taking down guards, neutralizing mercenaries, and closing off every exit. They moved like shadows, invisible and precise. The meeting had just begun, and the syndicate was already on the back foot. Jason and Sarah entered the room, weapons drawn. At the head of the table sat the new syndicate leader, a man with cold eyes and a ruthless smile. Victor Black's replacement, the new face of organized crime in the region. Jason stepped forward, locking eyes with the man. "This ends tonight." The room went still, the power in the air thick and charged. There were no more games to play, no more backroom deals. The fate of Redwood Hills would be decided in that room, and Jason had no intention of letting the syndicate rise again. The final arrest. The firefight that followed was intense, with mercenaries and associates of the syndicate putting up a last-ditch effort to escape or fight back. But Jason and his team were ready. They had trained for this, prepared for the worst, and executed the mission with deadly precision. In the end, the new leader of the syndicate, Mason Griggs, was captured. His empire was dismantled and the criminal network he had sought to rebuild was crushed. The people of Redwood Hills would no longer live under the shadow of fear and corruption. As the authorities arrived to take Griggs into custody, Jason looked out over the compound, the dust settling as the battle came to an end. It was over. For now. The road ahead, back in Redwood Hills, life began to settle into a new routine. People were rebuilding, businesses were thriving, and there was a palpable sense of hope in the air. But Jason knew that it wasn't the end. The battle for justice was never truly over. There would always be more to fight for. As Jason stood with his father, John, watching the sun set over the town, he knew one thing for certain. Redwood Hills had been saved not by their strength, but by their resilience. The fight wasn't about power or control. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were insurmountable. They had won. But in a town like Redwood Hills, there would always be more to protect, more to fight for. and Jason was ready for whatever came next. The events of the past months had left their mark on Redwood Hills, a town that had once been under the iron grip of organized crime. After Jason Marshall and his team dismantled Mason Griggs' operation, things were beginning to look up for the town. But Jason knew the truth all too well. Peace was fleeting, and the weight of his past would always come back to haunt him. He had faced corrupt politicians, dangerous syndicates, and enemies who hid in the shadows. But even in victory, he felt the echoes of the war that had consumed his life for so long. The calm before the storm. Jason stood in front of Marshall's auto repair, watching the steady stream of cars driving past. The town had changed, but it still felt the same. The familiarity was comforting, yet unnerving, like a ghost lingering in the corner of his mind. It was quiet now, but Jason knew better than to trust the silence. Behind him, his father, John Marshall, had been overseeing the repairs of a vintage car brought in by one of their regular customers. Despite the ongoing challenges, John had insisted on returning to work, as if the rhythm of their everyday life could somehow ease the burden of everything they had been through. Jason had always admired his father's resilience. "Got another one, Dad," Jason said, gesturing to a beat-up truck that had just pulled into the parking lot. His father grunted, acknowledging the work ahead. It was a small comfort, returning to the work that had always grounded them. But there was something different now. It wasn't just the work they were doing. It was the weight of the responsibility on Jason's shoulders. It had been a long fight, and Jason was no stranger to sacrifice. But even with the syndicate and Mason Griggs gone, Jason had a feeling something bigger was looming on the horizon. An unexpected visitor. As Jason wiped his hands on a rag, the sound of footsteps broke through the monotony of the repair shop. He turned to see a familiar face, Agent Lisa Monroe, a key FBI agent who had helped bring down Victor Black and his network. She stepped inside, her expression serious. "Jason, we need to talk." Jason glanced at his father, who raised an eyebrow but continued working on the truck. "What's going on, Lisa?" "There's been a development," she began, her voice low. "We've been tracking movements in the criminal underworld, and we've just discovered something alarming. We've got intel suggesting that Alexander White wasn't the only one operating in the shadows. There are remnants of his empire still in play, powerful players who have stayed hidden. Worse, we've identified a new threat." Jason's heart sank. He had hoped that after everything, Redwood Hills could finally heal. But he knew better than to believe in lasting peace. "Who are we talking about?" Jason asked, feeling the weight of the situation pressed down on him once more. "An organization that's even more dangerous than what we've seen so far. They're calling themselves the Dominion," Lisa replied. "They've been pulling strings across several states, but they've kept their operations under the radar. They're much more organized than the syndicate, with deeper ties to both the political world and the criminal elite. We think they're trying to consolidate their power and expand." Jason's pulse quickened. "How deep does it go?" "Much deeper than we realized. We've tracked their movements, but the Dominion has resources that even we don't have. They've already infiltrated key government positions and law enforcement agencies. They're on the verge of establishing a monopoly over every illegal operation in the country. If they succeed, Redwood Hills won't be the only town at risk. They could spread their influence everywhere." Jason clenched his fists. This was exactly what he had feared. The battle was far from over. They had destroyed one empire, but another had risen in its place. The war against corruption and organized crime had just begun, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Preparing for the final offensive, Jason knew that he couldn't face the Dominion alone. He needed his team, and he needed resources. Sarah Williams and the rest of the crew had been integral in taking down the syndicate, and now they would be crucial in the fight ahead. "We need to move fast," Jason said, his voice resolute. "Get in touch with the team. We need to gather everything we can on the Dominion, their leaders, their operations, their connections, I want to know where they're vulnerable. Lisa nodded. I'll get the intel flowing, but we'll need all the help we can get. This won't be easy. The Dominion has a network that extends far beyond anything we've dealt with. They're organized, well-funded, and ruthless. Jason took a deep breath, his mind racing through everything they'd learned. He had fought too hard for this town to let it fall into the hands of another criminal empire. Redwood Hills had already been through hell, but this time Jason wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. He would strike before they even knew what hit them. The calm, before the final storm. That evening, as the night crept over Redwood Hills, Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of the battle ahead. The memories of his time in the military came rushing back, missions that had tested his resolve, moments when survival was the only thing that mattered. But this wasn't just about survival, it was about protecting the people he loved, the town he called home. His father, John, stood by the counter, washing his hands after another day of work. Jason walked up to him, and they exchanged a glance. They didn't need words. They had been through enough together to understand what was at stake. "I'll be fine, Dad," Jason said, though the unease in his voice betrayed the confidence he was trying to project. But this time, it's bigger. It's not just the syndicate anymore. There's a new enemy, and they won't stop until they have everything. John placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, his face worn but steady. "You've always known the cost of standing up for what's right, son. But I've got faith in you. We've been through worse, and we've always made it out on the other side." Jason smiled faintly, but the weight of his father's words lingered in the air. They had made it this far together, but this battle would be different. The Dominion wasn't just a group of criminals. They were a force that had carefully embedded itself into the very fabric of society. The stakes were higher, the risk greater, and the enemies far more dangerous. A call to arms. As Jason sat in his office late that night, going over the intel that had just come in, the sound of his phone ringing jolted him from his thoughts. It was Sarah Williams, and the urgency in her voice told him everything he needed to know. "We've got a location. They're holding a meeting tonight at an undisclosed location. It's time, Jason. We strike now." Jason stood up, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. The time had come. The Dominion thought they were untouchable, but they were wrong. The town of Redwood Hills, the people they had sought to destroy, were about to rise up again. "This is it," Jason said, determination flooding his chest. "We take them down tonight." The night was thick with anticipation. Jason Marshall stood alone on the roof of Marshall's auto repair, staring out into the distance at the skyline of Redwood Hills. The town he had worked so hard to protect, the town that had suffered so much under the grip of crime and corruption, was at a crossroads. The Dominion had taken root. Its influence spread far and wide. But Jason knew this was the final confrontation, the last stand for the future of this town. His father, John Marshall, stood inside, preparing the equipment Jason would need for the mission ahead. The old man had been through more than anyone could ever imagine. Wars, losses, and battles that had shaped him into the man he was today. Now at the cusp of yet another fight, he had a quiet resolve in his eyes. The old man wasn't backing down, and neither was Jason. "We've got one shot at this," Jason muttered to himself. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him. If they failed tonight, Redwood Hills could fall under the iron fist of a new criminal empire. But Jason refused to let that happen. The final assault, with the team assembled and the plan set in motion, they moved out under the cover of darkness. Sarah Williams, Agent Lisa Monroe, and the rest of their crew were in position, waiting for Jason's command. They had located the heart of the Dominion's operations, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the town. The factory, once a thriving industrial site, had been turned into a fortress, its walls lined with armed mercenaries and surveillance equipment. Jason had one mission tonight: take down the Dominion's leaders and wipe out their network for good. But there was one leader left to deal with, the man behind the curtain, Mason Griggs. Jason's gut twisted with the thought of Griggs. The man had been a key figure in the syndicate's operations, but his role in the Dominion had been a mystery until now. Jason couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Griggs had been the architect of this new empire, and he had to be brought down. If they didn't stop him tonight, his grip on the state would become even more unshakable. As they approached the factory, Jason's heart raced. Every sense in his body was on high alert. Sarah communicated through the earpiece, her voice steady. "We've got a clear route inside. There's a back door, heavily guarded, but we've disabled their cameras. We move in 5. Jason nodded and took a deep breath. This was it. It wasn't just about taking down Griggs anymore. It was about protecting everything he loved, about keeping Redwood Hills from being swallowed by the darkness that had claimed so many before it. The final confrontation. They breached the factory without a sound, taking out guards as they went. Their steps were swift, coordinated, each move precise. The building was massive, the shadows long, and every corner could hide a threat. But Jason's team had been through enough to know how to handle danger. They reached the heart of the factory, the final room where Griggs was rumored to be meeting with his top operatives. Jason's eyes flicked to the team, his signal clear. As they entered, the dim light revealed Mason Griggs, standing at the head of the table, flanked by a group of armed men. Griggs looked up, a cold smile playing on his lips. "Jason Marshall, I was hoping you'd come, but I knew you couldn't resist. You've taken everything from this town," Jason said, his voice low but filled with venom. "It ends tonight." Griggs chuckled, as if he had heard it all before. "You think you can stop this, Marshall? You're nothing but a small-time fixer, playing at justice. You can't fight a system this powerful." Jason took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Griggs. "I've fought bigger battles than you. I faced enemies who thought they were untouchable. But here's the difference. I have something you don't. The people of this town, and we're not afraid anymore." As Jason spoke, his team flanked him, surrounding the room. Griggs's men tensed, hands on their weapons. It was clear this wouldn't be easy, but Jason was determined. The tension in the room was thick, but Jason wasn't going to let fear stop him. "You're wrong," Jason said, his voice steady. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who's had enough, and it's over. Now." Without warning, the room erupted in chaos. Gunfire rang out, and Jason's team engaged the mercenaries. Sarah moved swiftly, taking down one of Griggs's men with precision. Agent Monroe handled another, her movements calculated and deadly. But Griggs wasn't going down without a fight. He pulled out a gun, aiming it at Jason, his eyes burning with rage. But before he could fire, Sarah dove, knocking his arm to the side. The shot went wide, hitting the wall behind them. "Jason!" Sarah shouted, ducking for cover. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment that would decide it all. Griggs was a formidable foe, but Jason had come too far to let him escape now. With a swift motion, Jason tackled Griggs to the ground, disarming him with a well-placed strike. The two men grappled on the floor, each struggling for dominance. But Jason was quicker, his years of training paying off. He twisted Griggs's arm behind his back, pinning him to the cold concrete floor. The end of the line. As the battle subsided and the last of Griggs's men were taken down, Jason stood over the defeated criminal. Mason Griggs looked up at him, panting, his defiance gone. "You've won," he spat, "but you'll never change anything. The system is too big. You can't take it all down." Jason glared down at him, his voice unwavering. "No, but we can start, and that's all it takes." With a nod, Sarah moved forward, cuffing Griggs. The job was done. The Dominion was no more, and Redwood Hills was finally free. As the authorities arrived, Jason stood in the center of the room, his heart still racing. Redwood Hills had been through a lot, but the fight for its future was just beginning. This battle had ended, but Jason knew that peace wouldn't last forever. There would always be more to fight for, more to protect. But for tonight, Jason allowed himself a moment to breathe. A new dawn for Redwood Hills. In the days that followed, Redwood Hills began to rebuild. Its people, its businesses, its sense of community. With Mason Griggs behind bars and the Dominions shattered, the town finally felt like it could breathe again. The corruption that had poisoned it for so long had been uprooted, but Jason knew that maintaining peace would take time. It wasn't just about fighting criminals. It was about making sure that the system that allowed corruption to thrive was dismantled, piece by piece. Jason stood with his father, watching as the town began to rebuild. The sun was setting, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had won. Epilogue, a promise for the future. Jason's work wasn't over. The fight for justice never truly ended. But for now, Redwood Hills was safe, and that was